G'day YouTube, Warbles on the lot here. Sunday, 22nd of October, and we're going to have the Mindfield.
Hello, you know exactly what show this is. This is the Mindfield. I'm Scott Stevens, and you're hearing my voice first up today because Walid Ali, my co-host and the usual frontman for this particular band, Walid's under the weather. Get well, buddy. I know you're there at home listening. But we're hardly disadvantaged by who we've got to fill in for Walid. Someone rather heroically and at very, very short notice has stepped into the breach. Now, ordinarily, in her day job, Joanna Cruikshank is senior lecturer in history at Deakin University. But today, she's helping me negotiate the ethical dilemmas of modern life. Hi, Jo.
Hello, Scott.
So, look, this is a thorny one today. I think in terms of modern moral dilemmas, and even this itself, I think, is a kind of interesting topic because it seems to me that in terms of moral dilemmas, it doesn't get more fundamental than this. I know that there are some people who view the persistence of racism within the modern West as being a moral topic, let's say, or being an area for moral concern. But I think there are a great many moral philosophers and a great many political theorists that would see the persistence of racism not as a moral topic, but in some ways as foundational, as fundamental, as in some ways infecting and rendering us complicit in pretty much everything we do. What do you think?
Look, as a historian, I think I'm constantly struck by the way the structures of many modern nations have been racial from the start. I think I would even say white supremacist from the start. And so I do think that questions of race and racial hierarchy are absolutely deeply structured in our culture, in our society, in the way that we think and act.
Yeah, and I should just foreground right off the bat that, one of the things I think makes this conversation interesting to me is that we do come to this topic from very different disciplinary perspectives. You're a historian, I've got a keen interest in moral philosophy. And yet, in many ways, in both fields, there's something fundamental, there's something systemic, there's something almost overall structuring about the problem of racism, which I think means then that some of the accidental ways or even incidental ways in which we, praise moments where we seem to have overcome racial divides or moments of profound symbolic value. For instance, in 2008, the apology that Kevin Rudd delivered to the First Nations for the practice of child removal. Those moments then become hailed in the popular press as a kind of watershed, as if now's the moment when we can close that particular chapter, we can move on to the next stage of our national life. And yet the history, even over the last decade, after so much optimism in 2008, there really has been an awful lot, hasn't there, in our national life that's left a lot to be desired.
Absolutely. I mean, on many measures, I think you would say racial inequality has become worse or more extreme. I think in the long view of history, there are many moments that might have been hailed as watersheds at the time, a long string of royal commissions and inquiries into issues around race and the oppression of people on racial grounds, changes to the constitution, changes to laws. And each of these at the time, has been framed as being the kind of moment that is going to turn things around. And yet, historically, I think it's very hard to point to a time when substantial improvement in racial equality has actually occurred.
And even simply viewed on the symbolic register. I mean, this year, it seems to me, has been a particularly dire year. There's been the findings from the inquest into the death in custody of Miss Doe in Perth. There was the not guilty verdict that was handed down in the case of Elijah Dowdy. I mean, neither of those things have done anything to restore faith in the justice system. I've been struck, and like you, I imagine, I've been rather troubled by the political response as well to the National Constitutional Convention at Uluru, that after such a clear and unequivocal and I think morally rich and to my mind rather historical set of demands, there's been a how can I put this? There's been a kind of conspicuous political muteness. It's almost as if our politicians have had no way really substantially to respond to the call for something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to the onset of something like a genuine process of treaty with the First Nations of this land, to, instead there's the falling back on the more comfortable terrain of symbolic gestures like recognition. And then we've got, again, these grubby public debates about things like the Australia Day date. As soon as there's any call for historical truth-telling, it's almost immediately shouted down with howls of protest and, the reassertion of a kind of muscular white nationalism. I mean, this for me is really the symptom of something that remains very deep and very wrong with who we are.
Yes, and I perhaps I should be more realistic, but I have for 10 years taught university students about the history of colonisation. And every year I think I'm going to get a group of students who will have had a more thorough grounding in the basic facts of colonial history and the history of relations between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people since then. And over 10 years, I would say I've seen virtually no shift in the knowledge levels of people coming into university. And that's striking because I think, as you say, this is a period when certain issues have been far more widely recognised and accepted perhaps at a broad social level, like the stolen generations.
Yeah, and then look, we're leaving aside then the elephant in the room, which is what's transpired over the last 10 years. And just note that in 2008, Kevin Rudd delivered the apology to the stolen generations, and in 2008, the United States elected its first black president. And yet, who could have imagined, well, as a matter of fact, some very, very smart people, in fact, did imagine that 10 years on, we would see how things have transpired then in American political life. I mean, not only these expressions of a kind of muscular and re-emboldened white nationalism that we've seen in Charlottesville and elsewhere, but also, I'm not sure if you've seen, but Ta-Nehisi Coates, most recently, this wonderful African-American journalist and political theorist, he's put forward this really interesting argument, I think, that what Donald Trump, in fact, is, precisely to the extent that he is a rejection of Barack Obama, that he, in fact, represents America's first white president. Here's a little clip where he explains what he means.
We never had a president who so much defined himself by the president that was before him, who just so happens to be our first black president. You can't actually have a white president, the idea of a white president, without having a black president before him, much just as you cannot have a white America in this country without having a black America.
That's Ta-Nehisi Coates speaking recently on MSNBC. Look, here's what I'd like to put to you, and I want to bring our guest into the conversation really soon because, I mean, quite frankly, she's a genius in this field. But here's the question, Joe, that I guess troubles me. What are we not getting about this problem? What are we not understanding? How could we have thought 10 years ago that things were getting so much better? Why are we surprised 10 years on that things have not just stabilized but gotten worse? What are we not understanding both about the nature of racism, but also, if I can even deepen the problem further, what are we not understanding about the problem of whiteness itself? The identity of being white. Because one of the things, I suppose, that has been conspicuous over the last 10 years is that at the same time that we've seen this resurgence or this persistence of racist sentiment, at exactly the same time, we've got these common denunciations or denials. Well, of course, I myself am not racist. I've got nothing against people of another race. How is it that these two things go together? What fundamentally, historically, politically, morally, philosophically, what are we missing about the tenacious character of racism itself? Does that sound like a kind of interesting field to hoe?
I think that's a terrific question. I would say, though, that I think the we in that question is white people.
Yes.
I don't think black people, people of colour, would necessarily find any of that so surprising or so unanswerable. I think we are surprised. We're talking about a white community of intellectuals and others.
I couldn't agree more, and that really is why I think, in the way that we're framing this, in some ways we need to begin thinking about whiteness itself as, if you like, a moral problem. And there are those, of course, that would strongly disagree with me, even those who are sympathetic to the overall line of questioning, that would see morality really as anything to do with this. Morality, in fact, as a way of, if you like, either hedging our bets or wiggling our way out of complicity. But that's exactly why we want to bring our guest into the conversation. You are, of course, listening to the Mindfield. I'm Scott Stevens. Waleed is sick today, and Joanna Cruikshank from Deakin University is wonderfully and heroically filling in. You can listen to us anywhere you like. You can either try the ABC Listen app, you can subscribe to our podcast, or, of course, listen to the radio, as I imagine you're doing right now. Our guest, Alana Lenton, is Associate Professor in Cultural and Social Analysis at Western Sydney University. She's also the President of the Australian Critical Race and Whiteness Studies Association, and we're absolutely thrilled to have her on the show. Hi, Alana.
Good morning. Thanks for having me, Scott.
Let me just put this kind of difficult scenario directly to you. We've seen, at very least, the status quo continuing over the last decade in terms of race. Or we've seen things get worse. At exactly the same time, it's now common for people to come out and to deny that they themselves are racist while engaging in either forms of speech or patterns of behavior that would be, I think, rightly, morally described as racist. How do these two things go together?
Okay, well, I'd like to start off actually by acknowledging that here in Sydney in the ABC studios, I'm actually sitting on land stolen from the Gadigal people. And this is not immaterial to your question, because I think that we need to actually go much further back in history in order to understand why denial is so central to the way in which you discuss racism, and think about actually the idea of not racism, so the idea of distancing oneself from racism as actually being integral to the very idea of racism was set up. Because as soon as you talked about racism, which is actually, you may not know, but actually an invention of around the 1920s and 1930s in Europe, not something that has a longer history. We've spoken about race for a lot longer, but not racism. But built into that idea of racism was this idea that it was always something external, something akin to a kind of a tumor that grows on the body, but that with good surgery or chemotherapy, perhaps we can excise. That's always a question of excess. It's always the question of bad people having bad attitudes, or perhaps ignorant people, uneducated people imposing their will on us, and that we, again, moral society, if you like, as civilized people, are not involved in what racism is about. And so if we think about it from that perspective, we can understand why so many white people, and I think it is important to name white people as being the problem here, are so resistant to the idea that they themselves personally have any investment in whiteness, not as identity, but as Aileen Morton Robinson says, as possession, or as Cheryl Harris says, as property. Racism as materiality. Racism as something that endows us with benefit over others, over racialized people.
Joe, what do you think?
Absolutely, yes. I think the incredibly deep commitment to resisting the description of racism is only understood in those terms. Because, as you say, historically, conceptually, racism is linked to not racism, and I am not racist.
But I think, this raises, just in the interest of kind of total conceptual clarity here, I think this raises a very important notion about the nature of whiteness itself. When we talk about whiteness, please correct me if I'm wrong, but we are not talking about, say, a genetic marker. We're not talking about a phenotype, say. What we are, in fact, describing here is, if you like, the historical and political accretion of power, such that can then be exercised over some group that is defined as not in possession of that power, a group that is defined, if you like, by their possessibility.
Absolutely. Whiteness is something that can be conferred on others, but also taken away.
And I think that's why it's important to understand it about precisely, as I said before, not about identity and certainly not about genetics or race in the naturalized sense of the term. There's also a misunderstanding at play here, which is very convenient, I think, which is that race is ultimately about racial science, but actually race has a much longer longevity. And racial science really only comes on the agenda in full force in the 19th century.
Okay, back immediately.